Vice Chair of Education, and it is my absolute pleasure today to be able to welcome you and to introduce you to our first of two Research Trainee Award Grand Rounds. For those in the audience that are unfamiliar with our Research Award Trainee Grand Rounds, this is now our 5th year recognizing and celebrating in this context and at this level the fantastic research that our trainees are doing across the department. It is my pleasure to be your MC for today, and we have 2 out of the 4 trainees who will be talking today, and I think it really reflects in some ways the breadth of work that's going across our department as we go from cognitive neuroscience all the way to social determinants of health today. I'd also like to just thank specifically the members of the awards committee, including my co-chair Susan Vogelmeyer sitting in the back, Andrew Crystal, our vice chair for research, Jim Sorensen over there, and Steve Hinshaw, who I believe won't be able to make it today. So I want to thank them as well. We put a lot of work into selecting the 4 trainees that we're going to hear this morning and then next month, and it was no easy process to do that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first mentor, Dr. Dan Mathlon, who will introduce Dr. Michael Jacob.
Thanks, Eric. Good morning. So it's did I do that? No. It's my pleasure to introduce our first honoree awardee, Michael Jacob, who's been a resident in the research track, working in our lab starting about 2 years ago. Michael has, well, first of all, did his bachelor's in cell biology and molecular biology at UC Berkeley. Then went on to medical school at University of Rochester, where he both did his MD and PhD in basic monkey physiology, focused on the motor system and sensory motor systems. The title of his dissertation was The Active Control of Self-Movement Perception, Neuronal Mechanisms, and Cognitive Aging. The point is that Michael had a strong background in basic neuroscience and monkey physiology, and looked forward to say, what skills and tools and methods do I need to add to my repertoire to be able to start thinking translationally in my research in psychopathology, and based on that had the wisdom to identify labs that are involved in human electrophysiology and hemodynamic imaging, and therefore he came to us. He looked through our considerable menu of unpublished data waiting for motivated, inspired trainees to take on, analyze, and write up, and took on a particularly challenging problem, which is a data set where we had collected, not simultaneously, but in parallel identical sessions, fMRI data and EEG-based event-related potential data in patients with schizophrenia and healthy controls during a semantic processing, semantic priming task. This became a vehicle not only for Michael to learn these human methods, which I have to say that he has worked very independently and really mastered a lot of the methods and acquired a lot of skills now, but also stretched to methods that integrate fMRI and EEG. And that's what he's going to be talking to you about today. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Michael Jacob.
Thanks for the introduction, Dan. Well, I'm very excited to tell you all a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing to try and understand language function in schizophrenia, and to try and bring together the methods of both EEG, evoked potentials, and fMRI. So a brief overview of what I'll be talking about this morning. First, I'm just going to introduce the idea of semantic priming and how we can use that to understand language dysfunction in schizophrenia. I'll describe some of the methods that we've used, including event-related potentials and fMRI, and how we combine them using something called joint independent components analysis. I'll present some of the data and our preliminary findings, which I think help us understand the functional anatomy of language processing. And then I'll conclude with some broader speculations about the implications of this work in terms of understanding the psychopathology of schizophrenia and language processing. So we all know that context matters, but in this case, it's really the semantic context that's provided by this visual information that helps us understand the language in this cartoon, and then help us decide whether or not we think it's funny or not. For those of you who maybe can't see, these are piggy banks, and this is a piggy bank physician using a magnet to try and extract some change from the piggy bank. And I can make this more concrete and show you a picture of coins, and then give you the word change. And your understanding and the meaning of the word change would be very different than if I had shown you this picture of the stock market and then shown you the word change. And this effect is known as semantic priming. And we can conceptualize how this might work using something called semantic networks. Again, using a priming example, if I give you a picture of an apple, you will likely associate to the word apple, but you will also associate to other things like pie and maybe other fruit such as banana. And you might be less likely to associate to a car or to change. And the distance in this network helps us represent how associated these terms are. We think that this is an automatic process, and in the psychological literature, this spread of activation, it's just known as semantic spreading activation. And so we have plenty of reason to expect that from our clinical work and clinical experience that language processing and semantic networks may be disorganized or impaired in schizophrenia. We all have our favorite examples of disorganized speech, things like clang associations, loose associations, outright tangentiality, and disorganization. This is just an example I found from the literature that I particularly like. But I do think it is sort of communicating something. The doctor asks the patient how you're doing, this list of things, and sort of finds that it's like a rose garden. Still seems to convey something. Nonetheless, these symptoms, loose associations and thought disorder, are thought to reflect an impaired semantic organization. And you might hypothesize that relative to healthy controls who have a particular spread of semantic activation, in schizophrenia, this spread of semantic activation might be overly broad, such that now seemingly unrelated words such as banana or car now become more closely associated. And again, we term this effect overly broad semantic networks, and this is something that has been very well studied in the basic linguistics literature. And I don't think this is purely an intellectual exercise. I think that this impaired semantic organization undermines one's ability to function in the world and has been linked to cognitive impairment. So the guiding questions for this research project are really first to ask, is there a physiologic marker of semantic organization? And to also ask, how are semantic networks represented in the brain? And finally, to ask, can the semantic brain networks, should we be able to find them, help us understand disorganization in schizophrenia? So now I'll talk a little bit about the methods for this particular project. we use a variant of a semantic priming task called the picture-word matching task to study this effect. And in the task, subjects are given this picture prime, they're followed by a blank screen, and they're given one of 3 words. 50% of the time, the word is a match to the original picture, and the other 50% of the time, it's a non-match. And these non-matches, or unprimed stimuli, come in 2 different flavors, either in category, such as both fruit, or out of category, such as car, which shares very little with the banana. The subjects then need to make a decision whether or not the word is a match or a non-match to the original picture. And as you can see from just the reaction time data alone, that there's an increase in the reaction time to unprimed or non-matched stimuli. And in particular, you see the longest reaction times for the in category, which we think likely reflects the difficulty of making distinctions between closely related words. And you'll also notice that for the schizophrenia patients here shown in this checkerboard, they have longer reaction times across the board. So it turns out that there is, in fact, a physiologic marker of semantic priming, or in this case, it's actually unpriming. It's well studied. It's known as the N400 evoked potential. And how we measure this is as follows. You measure the voltage potential and EEG across the scalp in the 3 conditions that we're interested in, the match and the 2 non-match conditions. And what we see in the healthy controls is that 400 milliseconds after the onset of the word stimulus, there's a negative going deflection when the stimulus, the word stimulus, is not a match. So the blue line is the out-of-category non-match, and the green line is the in-category non-match. When there's not a match, there's this negative glowing N400 deflection, which you don't see in the match conditions. That's this dashed line. And this N400 is reduced in patients, in schizophrenia patients. And if you subtract these solid lines from the dashed line, you get a difference wave shown here, and this really pulls out the priming effect. And you can see the reduction in the N400 amplitude in schizophrenia. Now, this result has been interpreted as being consistent with overly broad semantic networks. So to illustrate that, we show the semantic network in a healthy control, and when they're presented with an unexpected stimulus, expecting apple, and they get car, it generates the N400. Whereas in schizophrenia, they may have broader semantic networks. They get an unexpected stimulus, such as car, when they're expecting to see an apple, and then it generates a reduced amplitude N400. So that's the basic theory, and its links to neurophysiology. And I think in order for us to understand this effect a little bit more carefully, it's worth taking a look at what this N400 signal actually is telling us. And it's actually fairly well studied. It was originally discovered in the early 80s by Kutas and Hilliard, and it was found in the context of having subjects read sentences that end in a semantic violation or incongruity. So, spread the warm bread with socks. It's not the word you would expect. And so there's this negative going deflection, the N400. Now, this effect is not limited to just linguistic paradigms. It's present in visual paradigms. If you're given visual images of soccer players playing with a toilet paper roll, you'll get an N400. You can also get an N400 to arithmetic expressions that are unexpected. And that's really what the N400 is about. It signals something to us in the environment that's unexpected that we need to be paying attention to. This is important, or not what we expect. And so the next step with this project is really to ask, what's the functional anatomy of this signal? As you guys are probably aware, event-related potentials have excellent temporal resolution at the millisecond time scale, but if you look at their voltage distribution across the scalp, it really doesn't tell us much about anatomy or the spatial resolution of this signal. Now we can use something like fMRI to pinpoint spatial location and anatomy of activation. However, we also know that this bold signal, which underlies this fMRI response, is particularly sluggish and occurs over the timescale of seconds. And if what we're interested is these event-related potentials, you can see the effect is sort of over and done before the bold effect has really started to even pick up. So what we'd like to be able to do is to merge these two methods to try and leverage both of their strengths. And the way that we do this is to use a method that was developed by one of our collaborators, Vince Calhoun, called Joint Independent Components Analysis. Now, I'm not going to go into the mathematical background behind this method, but try and explain it in as conceptually as possible, so that in the hopes that it might make some sense to you. So this method relies on just taking the temporal information, the time course of the evoked potential, and the spatial information in the fMRI, and what it relies on is intersubject covariation, such that you would see here in brain number 2 or subject number 2, there's a reduction in this particular yellow waveform, and that might be related to this reduction in activity at this particular spatial location. And we go across all the subjects and look for places of covariation. The algorithm doesn't know whether or not the subjects have schizophrenia or they're just healthy controls. And what it results for us is something called fused components. And what these components are is it shows us the ERP and fMRI features that covary. In this case, a component with a downward waveform that covaries with this frontal source, and this other component which has an upward waveform and covaries with this more posterior source. So it gives us temporal and spatial maps for each component. And based on how we set up our experiment, what it's going to do is it's going to give us a spatial and temporal map for both of the conditions that we're interested in, the in-category and these out-of-category unpriming and non-match conditions. And it also gives us a loading weight for each subject, which basically reflects the magnitude of a particular subject's contribution to any of these components. So the subject relies at looking at data from 25 healthy controls and 24 schizophrenia patients. They're age matched, they have chronic illness, most of them are medicated on second-generation antipsychotics, and they complete these ERP and fMRI sessions. They're the same subjects, they're doing the same task, the recording sessions occur at different times. It's not a simultaneous experiment. And we pull in the ERP and fMRI data, which is the difference waves that I showed you earlier, as well as the fMRI contrasts of the non-match minus match. And I'll just emphasize that we're using differences and contrasts in this particular study design that we can really pull out just the effect of priming and cancel out or try to cancel out the effect of the sensory stimulus and the motor and all these other aspects of the task that may not be related to what we're interested in. So we use the joint independent components analysis to hopefully identify cortical areas in the fMRI that are linked to this N400. So now some of the results. The first question we would ask is, do any of these components capture or tell us something about the N400? That's what we wanted to know. And for the in category, where you have condition, non-match, this is the average waveform, the average difference wave for all the subjects, healthy controls, schizophrenia, everybody together. And then we can just look and see, do any of the components overlie the N400? Well, conveniently, it turns out that one of these components, number 2, here in this dashed red line, really does seem to overlie the response. And this component has an associated spatial map that goes with it. And this map is presented as a z-score of the difference between the in-category condition or non-match, in-category non-match, and the match condition. So in red, these are regions where there's greater activity when it's a non-match stimulus. And the way to understand this map is that the greater the magnitude of this N400, that this map covaries with the N400, such that the greater the magnitude of the N400, the greater the z-score in these maps. And you can see there's some posterior cingulate activation amongst a widespread activation, but some as well as supramarginal gyrus, angular gyrus. Now how about the out-of-category condition? Well, conveniently, we actually find it's the same component, component number 2, that really does capture the N400. However, the spatial maps are actually somewhat different. Here we seem to find more posterior occipital activation, premotor activation, as well as posterior parietal. Okay, so now we've done this fancy analysis. What does this mean? Can we make sense of any of this? So just to revisit, this is what a fuse component is that it gives us areas in the brain that co-vary with the amplitude of this N400, this non-match effect. But we know that this component is actually comprised of the weights of multiple individual subjects. And each one of these subjects has a different magnitude contribution of this individual component. And that's what this loading weight is. It tells us about the magnitude of a particular component. We can take these loading weights and see if they relate to anything in the behavior of the task that we might be interested in. So for example, we could take the loading weight and see as the magnitude of the loading weight increases, the number of errors in the task decreases. And as the magnitude of the loading weight increases in an individual subject, the reaction time gets faster. And although these are fairly modest correlations, it does suggest to us that the greater the magnitude, the better the performance in the task. What does this tell us about schizophrenia? Well, we can do the same thing. We can look at all of the individual subjects and just find out which ones have the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And what you see is that there is a reduction in the loading weights for this particular component, component number 2, in schizophrenia relative to healthy control. What this tells us is that these maps and the amplitude of the N400, this whole thing is reduced in schizophrenia. And you can see the utility of this. It's both a strength and a weakness. The strength is that it's a single statistical test that tells us that they're different. The weakness, of course, is that it really doesn't tell us too much more about what aspects of these maps are different. And that's where I'm going to turn next. It suggests that reduced activation of this N400 signal is associated with reduced activation in these particular maps. But what does that mean? So the approach that we've taken to try and understand that is to take these maps and threshold them at a particular z-score, and then use these maps to go back and look at the activity in the brain in healthy controls and schizophrenia. And what you see is that actually in category condition, the maps are fairly similar. It's the out-of-category condition in which there's a reduction in activity in schizophrenia. And you can see that plotted here, that while there's an overall reduction in schizophrenia, there's the most pronounced effect is for this out-of-category condition. And you can see, for example, here the reduction in sort of occipital posterior processing. Okay, so what does this tell us so far? One, the method seems to work, and that the joint independent components analysis helps us identify the functional anatomy that's linked to this semantic priming electrophysiologic signature that we're interested in. But it also tells us something kind of surprising, that these two networks seem to be pretty different. It also tells us that there is reduced activation of N400 networks in schizophrenia. So what exactly are these networks that we've pulled out? And we can go back to the literature. Plenty of people have been studying semantic priming and have been studying language processing in the brain. So what do we know already? Well, from a meta-analysis completed by Jeffrey Binder of over about 120 fMRI semantic contrasts, these are tasks where subjects are making distinctions between things like words and pseudo-words, where pseudo-words are things that are pronounceable but have no meaning. And what Jeffrey Binder outlined is really two distinct networks: a semantic network that consists of many midline, both posterior and anterior sources, as well as temporal and posterior temporal areas, and this perceptual network that sort of seems to fill in everything else. And he went so far as to describe that these networks, this semantic network reflects conceptual processing and is an internal process, whereas these perceptual networks tell us something about what's out in our environment, in the external world. And we seem to notice that, well, there's kind of an interesting overlap between this internal conceptual network that Jeffrey Binder had identified in red and this external perceptual network here identified in yellow. And I would say that it's not a stretch to sort of think that in order to determine the difference between an apple and a banana, you're going to need to invoke conceptual processing. So this seemed to fit. But what I really think was more of a surprise was this out-of-category condition, pulling out the perceptual networks. I do think it seems to make some intuitive sense in that if someone was to ask you what's the difference between a banana and a car, you would just sort of say, I just know they're different. You wouldn't have to think about it all that much. But nonetheless, it doesn't tell us, it's not a very satisfying answer as to why in particular these brain areas might be associated with that type of semantic processing. So I'm going to conclude and discuss a little bit more about what we think is going on in these particular networks. And the question we really have to wrestle with is why recruit these perceptual visual areas for a conceptual semantic task? And why aren't these areas recruited in schizophrenia? And I think the place to begin is to go back and look at this perceptual, conceptual distinction and think that, well, there's quite a bit of overlap, actually, that we know from research in the literature that between these two networks, and maybe this dichotomy is not as strong as we think it is. There's a whole field known as embedded cognition, which posits something like the following: that the meaning of a word, such as apple, is not merely a programmed list of conceptual features, but rather is composed of the sensory motor experiences that we expect to be situated in the world upon hearing the word apple. So we like to think of the brain as being conveniently, maybe divided into sort of this perceptual processing modules and then higher order conceptual processing modules. And that classic view goes something like this, that you see an apple, there's a representation of this apple in your occipital and visual processing areas, and that this representation gets passed up the cortical hierarchy into increasing levels of conceptualization. However, I think we know this view is simplistic and incomplete, that there's significant feedback between all of these areas, and in particular we know that what we expect to see has a major influence on what we perceive in the environment. And there's a growing list of examples that our perceptual processing and what we expect to see has an enhanced representation of our perceptual expectations and associations. So it's not that we're not just building an image of an apple in our mind, we're building an image of an apple and all the other things about apples that we want to know about, fruit and pie and all that kind of thing. And you can see how in our task we really built this in that we're asking the subjects, when is something a violation to this? When is something that we don't expect? And that's what the N400 signals. So I'm going to go through this a little bit more carefully in the context of our particular task. So when there's a match between expectations and what we perceive, such that in the condition where you get an apple, you have a set of perceptual expectations and associations. When you see a word stimulus, such as apple, it gets processed up the hierarchy, and everything checks out. It's what we expected. There's no N400. However, when there's not a match between our expectations and what we perceive, such in the case you're primed with the apple, you're expecting the apple, and then you get a banana, Well, this also gets processed up the hierarchy until we realize that this isn't the type of fruit that we're looking for. And that generates the error signal, it generates the N400, and we think that this reflects activation of this conceptual network in order to make the distinction between a banana and an apple. So that seems to be the somewhat easier case to understand. But then how about for these out-of-category, non-matched conditions? Well, in this case, you get primed with the picture of an apple. You're expecting an apple and maybe some other fruit. But instead, you get this word stimulus, which is a car. And as that is processed up the hierarchy, we recognize this isn't even really the type of object that we're looking for. It's not even a fruit. It generates the N400 error signal, and it does so by activating these perceptual networks. And in particular, would highlight the activity in occipital visual areas. And what this suggests is that healthy subjects are able to benefit from this increased visual activity, which is representative of perceptual expectations and associations, to then help you make the distinction that a car is not related to any of these perceptual things that I was expecting to get. And that's sort of the speculation or hypothesis here, is that unrelated picture-word non-matches are at least partially resolved by visual and perceptual activity. And so what's going on in schizophrenia? Well, so we know that they generate the same error signal. It's just in reduced magnitude, the N400. But they also show a reduction in this visual activity, and this suggests that they're really not able to utilize their perceptual expectations to help them differentiate the signal. They're still able to do the task. It takes them longer. They get it correct, but they're not drawing on the same cortical networks that the healthy controls are drawing upon. So why might this be? This sort of raises additional questions. Why would that happen? And I'm going to put forward two hypotheses. One hypothesis is the one that I really already discussed, which is semantic spread, a broad spread of semantic activation. And another is something about an impoverished or degraded perceptual signal. So here's what that might look like. In schizophrenia, they encode this picture prime. They have a set of perceptual expectations and maybe associations. And we know from this ERP data, the reduction here in this N400 amplitude, that may reflect a broadened semantic network, such that maybe now they're including more things in their perceptual network. Now maybe they are in fact including maybe some unrelated perceptual items, such as a car, and that they have an overly broad perceptual activation. Now, to show you the other hypothesis, let's see, I need to show you something that I left out in the original data that I sort of glossed over, which is to say that this dashed line here in the evoked potential reflects the activity to when it's a match, when they're primed with an apple and they get the apple. And actually what you see is there's a reduction in the match in schizophrenia subjects. And what this says is basically that when they see an apple, it's just not as much of the apple it's not still as much of a match as they would have expected. It's not as apple-like in some sort of way. So both things that match aren't congruent enough, and then things that don't match seem to be more related. And this, I would put forward another idea. So here's the apple stimulus that doesn't match. I would put forward another idea that maybe what's happening is that there's a degraded representation of all of these perceptual expectations in the system. And the result of that degradation in perceptual expectation means that when a stimulus like car comes in, they're not able to utilize their visual system to help them make sense and to make these distinctions that the healthy control subjects are able to do. Okay. And so they're unable to draw on this additional visual perceptual information to solve the task. So, summary and conclusions. First thing we find, is that this analysis does help us identify the anatomy of the N400, this priming signal. It also suggests that the circuit physiology at a network level is really pretty flexible, that depending on the nuanced details of the task and the stimuli, the brain recruits a very different set of cortical networks, and that these networks are reduced in schizophrenia. I do think this is consistent with the idea of overly broad semantic or even overly broad perceptual networks. But it also suggests that there's impaired perceptual and semantic expectations in schizophrenia. And you could think actually a little more broadly about how disabling it might be to have, an inability to predict what's going on in the world, but also to have a really impoverished representation of what's going on in the world in the first place. And you can think a little bit more speculatively about how that might relate to things like hallucinations and delusions and cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia, those things that we know are so disabling that really does require us to have this active monitoring and predictive ability to know what's going on in the world. So quite a few limitations and future directions. This is clearly an exploratory project. We didn't we had some hypotheses going in, but we just wanted to see how does this stuff all line up, what's going on. And this approach that we use to bridge these two methodologies is not yet fully standardized. We don't know what are the best tools to use and the best way to analyze the data. We're figuring that out as we go. And I think what's most important one of the biggest limitations, at least that I see, is that although we have some relationship to the task, it's really unclear how these components relate to the clinical measures or even cognitive measures that we might be interested in. And that's where I would want to take work like this in the future, is to sort of link it to perceptual and cognitive tasks that have some sort of real world meaning and say, okay, does this help us understand how people function? And then just to give you an idea of additional approaches that I'm taking with this work is that we can take these networks that I find and use them as nodes in a connectivity analysis and find that, if we vary the semantic distance between these picture words to sort of look at a more nuanced view of the stimuli on a parametric level, what we're starting to see is that the connectivity between some of these visual areas and the conceptual areas really depend on how far apart the words are from the original picture, at least in terms of their semantic distance. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their attention, and in particular, I want to thank my mentors, Judy and Dan. I want to thank, from our brain imaging and EEG lab, I want to thank Brian Roach, who really helped me develop and work with the independent components analysis and algorithms. I want to thank Vince Calhoun, our collaborator at the Mind Research Network. Of course, the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and the Residency Research Training Program, and Sue Vogelmeyer, and all the work that everyone has put in to make such a great both training and research training program. And of course, I couldn't help myself. I want to thank my family, my wife in particular, and my 2.5-month-old son, Asher. And I will leave you with him and this quote from David Abram, a philosopher, that I think kind of speaks to this intersection of both language and perception. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yes.
Really nice job. Question: how do you tell the difference between the schizophrenia versus control, difference in physiology or brain structure versus differences in attention and motivation?
Right. Excellent question. So the question is, how do we tell differences between a true effect, I think, of disease or of schizophrenia, or just impairments in attention or motivation to complete the task? And I think this is sort of like always a struggle in terms of what any sort of cognitive task like this. One thing that I would say is that we're able to really carefully study what's going on behaviorally, to sort of see that the semantic priming effect, for example, is the same in schizophrenia as it is in healthy control. It just takes them longer, and this is something that's well studied in terms of their reduction in processing speed. And there are folks who really study things like cognitive control, and they're constantly wrestling with, well, is this increase in processing speed, is that just due to the fact that they're really slow, or are they just not trying? And I think some of that literature has helped us understand that, no, there is an element of cognitive control that is impaired in schizophrenia. So I think it's really carefully understanding what's going on in terms of the behavior, and also trying to think about that in relation to other literature.
If I could just throw in
Sure.
a comment. So another point related to your question is there are different variants of semantic priming tasks that tap into more controlled processes where attention and motivation can play more of a role, versus that tap into more automatic processes. And it hinges on the reaction time, or not the reaction time, but the timing between the prime and the target. In this case, the prime comes up for 250 milliseconds.
Right.
And then there's only a 75 millisecond gap between that and when the target appears. And we're looking at with the ERPs, the brain response, 75 milliseconds following the prime, which is really not enough time for cognitive control processes, or the lack of those processes to be in play to account for differences. And that's also reflected, well, performance was also pretty good for patients. Sorry.
No? Thank you. Yeah, Jen.
Thanks for the great job, Michael. Two questions. One is, I was really struck by how similar the network that you pulled out were to Binder's networks. And I'm wondering if the sort of conceptual dichotomy that you set up in any way maps on, or can be sort of reframed in the context of the default mode network versus task following, sort of like inward looking versus interactive with the external people. And then the second question is, I'm wondering if the N400 has been looked at with respect to various levels of disorganization in certain patients and
Yeah. Good couple of questions. The first question is, what about the default mode network? How does that relate? Whoops. Sorry about that. I guess it's gone now. What's that? It's okay. What's that? No, it's okay. So the default mode network and then N400 is related to behavior. I was going to pull back up the Jeffrey Binder's networks, and he really actually comments on that, right? That internal conceptual network looks a lot like the default mode network. And actually, I think my own particular bias with this is that I don't particularly like the term default mode network, and that I think if you go back to the literature as early as even the early 90s, maybe even earlier than that, when they were beginning to use PET imaging to understand brain function, they had subjects lie back in the scanner and just rest, right? And those experiments were called random episodic silent thought. And if you look at the data that comes out of that, it looks just like the default mode network. The subjects are sitting there, they're lying, and they're just thinking. They're thinking about, what do we do when we lie in the scanner? We think, and we activate language structures. So I think that Jeffrey Binder makes a really valid point that, this default mode network really is overlapping with a language network. And I guess in terms of reframing that with our results, I'd have to think a little bit more carefully about that. I think that just that the default mode network, from my perspective, likely does represent a language network. And then the other question is looking at N400 and cognitive variable relation to other cognitive or clinical variables such as disorganization. In some of the initial work that Dan and Judy published on this, they did find actually some correlations between the N400 but interestingly, they found the strongest correlations are actually with negative symptoms, and I don't know about other data looking at N400 and disorganization. It's hard to show. Oh, Judy says there's some in Alzheimer's data, but I think that one, we're relying on clinical measures like the PANS, which is not great, I don't think, at making this connection from my perspective. And the other thing is I wonder if the negative symptoms in particular, things like poverty of thought, actually are related to this, right? In that if there's a degraded representation of our semantic and perceptual world, you're not going to have as much to think about in terms of that symptom. So, thanks, Jen.